Welcome back, everybody. Just waiting for breakout rooms to close and for folks to come back from having a little bit of social community connection time. It has been so much fun already, and we are not done yet. I know some folks have had to leave because of time zone differences, and I am so grateful for the folks who are sticking in with us on Zoom. If you are just joining us on Zoom or just tuning into the live stream, welcome to Solo Polyamory Day. My name is Mel. I am a queer solo polyamorous relationship anarchist, and I live on the unceded territories of the Comox Nation on so-called Vancouver Island, which are the traditional territories of the Comox, Pentlak, Hamalko, Wewekai, Wewekum, and Tla'amin peoples. I'm what I call a second generation third culture kid. I've grown up in a mix of different cultural influences, and I'm also one of the co-founders of the Solo Polyamory Facebook group. And I am so stoked to be doing this event today for Solo Polyamory Day. I'm going to welcome in my next guest in just a moment, but just to refresh our memories about the safer space guidelines that we have here today. Pardon me, I just ate some food. So safer spaces. I use these when I'm teaching online, and I find it just helps create a really good space for us to connect together when we are in the virtual room. So when we meet online, there is never a guarantee of confidentiality. So please do exercise personal boundaries and discretion with what you share. I maintain control over the audio just to make sure that we have a smooth flow and avoid interruptions. These sessions are being recorded, and they'll be available on YouTube. I'm going to edit them for later viewing, and the sections of participant interaction that we've had are not recorded. Racism, misogyny, ableism, ageism, transphobia, and other forms of discrimination are not conducive to a positive community environment, and they will not be tolerated. Anti-science rhetoric, conspiracy theories, COVID-19 denialism, anti-masking, QAnon, and related alt-right and fascist ideologies are harmful, and the support or perpetuation of them will result in being removed from the event. This is something very important to me as someone who lives with long COVID and as someone who's an advocate for inclusion for the disabled and immunocompromised and otherwise at-risk individuals in our community. If you have any questions about that, you are welcome to contact me, Melina at radicalrelationshipcoaching.ca. Wow, I almost forgot my own email. I think I've been talking a lot today. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome in our next guest, Jada. Welcome. So Jada, this is the first time that you and I are actually meeting face to face, and I'm so excited for this. When I first jumped on Instagram at the beginning of 2020, before lockdown, and I was looking around at like, who's talking about these things? Like, I was worried that I'd get onto Instagram and find that the only people talking about solo polyamory would be like white Instagram influencers. And I came across your account, which is Jada_kissed. And I was like, oh, thank goodness. Thank goodness. And I have continuously been moved and blown away by and impressed by what you share on there. And I know you've had times where you've had to take a break from that. And I think that's wonderful. You know, we all need to exercise that self-care. But I was so stoked when I reached out to you to be part of today, and you were like, yes, please.
Yeah,
So I want to invite you to introduce yourself a little bit more to folks here, and yeah, tell us a little bit more about like what has your journey been in solo polyamory.
absolutely. Thank you so much. I was honored myself, like semi-fangirling about you reaching out to me because you are also someone that I have looked up to within the like solo poly and Facebook group, by the way, which I feel like is my favorite Facebook group. And I just don't like other Facebook groups. They're not as you were mentioning earlier, like it really is about the community and all of us coming in this like judgment-free place to like support one another. And so to find a healthy kind of Facebook group dynamic was refreshing. And then your blog post along with solopoly.net were ones that really helped me just like understand some natural feelings that I was having in my own polyam journey, which I could get into later. But yeah, hi everyone. For those who I have not met, I think most folks in here I have not met. My name is Jada Suwanasi. I use she, they pronouns, and I am a sexuality and relationship educator, usually on the interwebs. I also do in-person workshops, mostly with college students and universities, as well as one-on-one peer support. And so I really more entered into like talking about solo polyam just because I was exploring it personally. It wasn't like I was trying to be an Instagram content creator. I feel like I'm still not. When it comes to that, I just am like, here are questions I have. Do other people also have these questions? And it was surprisingly, yes, a lot of people are thinking about this too. And so I feel like my journey into this space, if you will, like many folks, like not having the language for it yet, but I started questioning kind of being off the relationship escalator back in college when I just started wondering, asking myself if I actually wanted to have children. And I feel like
Mm,
that was kind of the seed of just like, oh, I get to kind of decide for myself what type of I guess like outcome I want for my life in the future when we think about these things. And um that I think the question of being child free was my first kind of like unearthing or unlearning for myself of what it means to relate to other people. And then when you start questioning not having kids, you get lots of critiques. You get lots of people who challenge, you get lots of people who push back. And it also I had to shape the way I was dating, the way I
mhm.
was relating to other people, right? Of like, here are the things that I'm potentially not interested in the long term. Is that okay? Is that not okay? And so even that I think cracked open a little bit of what I needed to think about when it came to potential partners. Um, in 2016 is when I say was my catalyst into actual polyamory and non-monogamy, and it was Marsha. It was actually when I was living in the Bay Area, so I was like so honored to also just listen to her speak. It was when I was living in the Bay Area. Um, I had a partner who cheated on me and claimed that they were polyamorous. Unfortunately, we just don't know. We've heard that before. And I'm like, I don't think that's how that works. I'm pretty sure, like the very little that I knew about non-monogamy, like I think I'm supposed to know that we're both doing it together, which was not the case. Um, and so I think a friend just kind of told me because I was still curious. I was still like, okay, I need to understand. Like, even though I was not choosing to be with that partner anymore, I wanted to understand, like, what is this? How do people do this? Particularly women of color.
Mhm.
Because what I was finding on the internet was, as you said, like mostly white folks. And I didn't know anyone else in my circle who was practicing this. I had some like queer friends who maybe had like also had inklings about it, but weren't necessarily practicing it that I know of. And so I dragged a couple of my friends along to this group. I think it was like a discussion group, a polyam discussion group in San Francisco that Marshall was leading at the time. And I was just like bringing my notebook, right, all prepared, very research mode, as you kind of generally enter into the polyam space for a lot of folks. Ethical slut, of course, buy this book, try and do all the Googling as you can and take in as much information as you can. And when I was sitting in that group, I was listening to all these experiences and the stories of other people. And I was like, oh, this actually does not clash with my value system at
Mhm.
all. Like the open communication, the just the lovingness of it, the care and intention into dating alone. Because at the time I was like now exploring what it meant to, dating a new person, not just like the long term relationships, but like dating in an ethical, caring, loving way was like, oh shit, yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. And so I think that really began kind of my journey into trying to use trying to implement polyam principles into my dating life, even though I didn't know I was going to practice polyam.
Mm-hmm.
So regardless of the trajectory that I was going to be on, of maybe I'll still end up in a monogamous relationship, end up, I use that in quotations, in a monogamous relationship, or maybe I will, you know, I was just more like, I just like what this, I like the principles of this. I like the ideas of this. I love the way people are moving with intentionality in the way that they're connecting with other human beings. Um, and so for years, I was like, I'm just exploring poly. That's like, I'm not poly, you know, like I'm not, no, I'm not. I just like, I'm just curious about it, you know? Um, and yeah, I'm also very like, I'm a slow, you know, yeah, I'm slow. I'm like, and that's how it was with my child free journey. I was like, I'm just curious what it would be like if I never had kids. It was like 10 years until I was finally like, yeah, I'm not having kids. Like that's, I'm pretty sure, I'm pretty certain at this point that that's not in the trajectory for me. Um, yeah, and so that's kind of been the short of like how I entered this space and solo poly in particular. It was I remember like kind of coming across it somehow. And it was I think one of your blogs and one of the blogs on solopoly.net. And I was like, holy shit, this makes so much sense to me. Things just started clicking in terms of like how almost like how claustrophobic I felt sometimes in my relationships. That's the word that I would use. I
Mm-hmm.
felt very restricted in when I was dating in with more of a monogamous lens. Um, and just feeling like, oh, like my independence, my need for independence wasn't a flaw. And
Yeah.
that was really big for me. And that still continues to be the theme of something that I don't wrestle with it anymore. I'm very certain about my need for independence in the sense of freedom. Um, but one thing that I wrote when I was thinking about what to talk about today was um, how that tends to be threatening for a lot of folks. That this idea that you can be too free.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure a lot of solo poly folks probably have to contend with that as well as, you know, when you're met with challenges or critiques. And then I started thinking deeper into this as an Asian femme and how, as a daughter, as the only daughter, as an Asian woman moving around in this world, there are very rigid ideas of what you're supposed to be
Mm-hmm.
for your family and for your community. There are very clear, defined roles of being the caretaker. Um, I also just have a lot of like a mediator in my family in a lot of ways, and so this idea of you want to be free, you want to make your own decisions that center yourself. That's ridiculous. That's unheard of, you know. And so that's those are things that I've kind of been sitting with as I share myself on the internet more and talk openly about solo poly and just how much it how folks just go into this place of immediate critiques.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's like two camps that I tend to find is when I'm very open about my solo polyness, it either goes into slut shaming or it goes into like the threat of loneliness. And these two
Yeah.
camps, I think it's fascinating. I'm not I don't feel like I don't take it personal at all, but I feel very I'm like this is so interesting to me. Um, yeah, but I can pause there. This is a
Uh,
little bit of like where I'm at right now in my journey.
that's great. When you're talking about like the partner who was polyamorous, but like his other partner didn't know, didn't tell you, like I if I had $1 for every time I came across someone on dating apps who was like, I'm polyamorous, but my partner doesn't know yet. And I'm like, that's not what that means.
No, complete opposite. That's
And
actually
I
not
mean,
at all what it is.
I would like to think that's happening less these days, but I've noticed on dating apps, people are using the term E&M more than polyamory. And
Mm-hmm.
that now just red flags for me altogether because I'm like, well, we could go down a whole rabbit hole of talking how ethics are culturally subjective. And also, I've seen a lot of people who are doing swinging and have like this internalized stigma or shame around it. So they don't want to say we're swingers, we're just looking for
Mm,
casual sex. We're looking for sex without the emotional entanglement. And they just adopt the term E&M. And I think even before that, people were adopting the term polyamory without really knowing what it means.
yeah, right, right. Yeah. And I think that's why for so long I was like, I'm just exploring this because I wanted to move with intention. If I were to really
Yeah.
say I am polyam, because I don't really know what that means, like for me, right? And just wanting to be honest about like this is something I'm interested in, or asking myself these types of questions. Because yes, I've been noticing kind of the same trend of folks saying ethical non-monogamy. I'm like, I don't really know what that means for you.
Mhm.
And maybe we can have conversations about it, but I don't know if we're on the same page with that definition. But as you learn, like most people are not on the same page with most definitions of relating.
I,
You
I,
know,
yeah, I think we talked about
yeah.
a lot of this today. We keep coming back to this idea of like, well, we use these terms and these labels to describe what we do, but we cannot let them prescribe what we do or make
100%.
assumptions about what they mean for other people. Because ask 10 different people what their definition of solo polyamory is, you get 10 different definitions. And I know
Mm-hmm.
certainly in the solo polyamory group, now we have the ability to ask screening questions when people join. And one of the questions we put in there is what does solo polyamory mean to you? We don't even ask people for a definition. It's very open ended. And it is
Mm-hmm.
fascinating for me to see what all the different responses are that people give. Yeah, Roz is saying there's so much variety. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I love that. I love that about this community, that we can all have our own personal definition and what it means to us. And part of the journey of getting to know each other is getting to understand what it means for us, and
Mm-hmm.
not just how we define it, but how it impacts the way we show up in the world, not just in our intimate relationships, but also how we relate to the other parts of ourselves too. And you're talking about that journey to be consciously child free. Part of my journey out of my marriage, because I got married when I was 22, which is
Mm.
ridiculous. What was I thinking? Um, but part of my journey out of that marriage was catalyzed by two miscarriages 3 months apart.
Wow.
And that was an incredibly challenging experience in the time. And I won't dive back into that too much, but um, a big thing that came out of that for me was the question of, do I actually want to do this, or am I just defaulting to this because as a person who was raised as a girl, there's just always been that assumption that you're going to have kids one day. You have to be a mother. That's your job, is to continue the family line and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Mm-hmm.
questioning of that became the catalyst for the questioning of so much else around the standard, like all the things I'd accepted about relationships.
Yeah, same, 100%. I think when people start asking me about non-monogamy and like how to just go into it, how did I, jump in and all of a sudden, like, did not jump. Like there were just multiple little steps here and there that I was, trying to take because I just wanted to define my life for myself. And I'm a naturally curious person, but I'm also a naturally maybe rebellious person. Maybe that's the Sagittarius in me. That makes us a little bit, I'm like, I'm just gonna do what I want. Like I can do it lovingly, but at the end of the day, I'm really gonna do what I want. And I think
Yeah.
also being solo poly lends to that. I was like, I get to do what I want and also have all the things that I want. And I think that too um, is uncomfortable for people to conceptualize
Yeah. It's
that
threatening.
you can. It's so threatening to be like, you can't be free and have all the love that you desire. No fucking way. Like somehow that's mind blowing.
And I don't know if you've encountered this, but I certainly encountered this, especially early on, was that even people who were polyamorous felt threatened by this.
Mm,
And I am often curious of, was it more threatening because I was a femme going in with this and having the kind of agency that I think is more readily afforded in mononormative culture to cis men.
mm-hmm.
That there's a stereotype of like being the player.
Yep.
But I say that knowing all full well that a lot of men also receive stigma in solo poly. Um, but the threat of like, you are this slut, you are
Yes.
this danger, you're going to be the home wrecker, you don't have a primary partner keeping you in check, you might
Mm-hmm.
try to lasso away my partner, like all these different layers of fear. um and the threat and how people would then respond to me in that.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
it was it was challenging. I'm really glad I found a good therapist eventually, because
Shout out to
trying to
your
make sense
therapist.
of it was like, what?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just
Shout
trying to
out to our
love
therapist.
people.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I 100%. I don't know if I've encountered it too often, like directly, but I feel like I can see that's what's happening in people's minds when I talk about the way that I'm relating. Like you can sense it and you can feel it in the questions, the way they're questioning you, right? Of like not understanding, but also in a way of like, no, yeah, like essentially we, talked about slut shaming, and then especially to be, well, first to be someone who chooses to be child free as well. It's like, oh, you really just like don't want to be responsible for anything. You don't want any commitments. How selfish of you,
Yeah.
right? For me to say that, like, I don't want to have children because I don't think that they're going to add value to my life, which I said multiple times, and they're like, what the fuck are you talking about? That is threatening for people, right? Or to say that I don't want to get married because I, again, don't see it adding that much value to my life that I already have. And it's, yeah, I don't think people know how to, like, again, they go back to either just like, you're a slut, you're going to break up, whatever, all these relationships, you're just doing whatever the hell you want. And then the threat of like, oh, if she doesn't care that she's a slut, then she's just going to die lonely.
Yeah. The pity.
She's going to end up alone. Yeah, right, right. At the end of the day, the world doesn't look good for you.
Mm-hmm.
Like my value is tied to whether or not I am tied to someone else, whether it's a child, right? If you're not a mother, what is your point in society?
Yeah.
If you are not a wife, what are you doing?
Yeah. And that's one of those, like, I mean, patriarchy has different forms in different cultures. And I think for those of us who live in mixed culture spaces, we have all different layers to unpack around that. And I know one of my best friends is from Singapore, and we've talked a lot about what patriarchy looked like for her growing up. And
Mm-hmm.
I have a little bit of sense of the sort of Asian culture patriarchy, the ways it's same but different. And
Mm-hmm.
like that internalized patriarchal idea of whatever the narrative is, that you are expected to be a certain way. There is a template for how you're supposed to be a woman. There's also a template for how you're supposed to be a man. Very few cultures have any kind of template for if you are non-conforming or trans or
Mm-hmm.
non-binary, or two-spirit, or any other gender. And and they're very limiting, they're very reductive, and they feel very controlling. And I know when we started talking about this, having this conversation, one of the things that you mentioned was like solo polyamory as a piece of political resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really curious about that, because I know what that means for me, but I would
Mm,
love to know what that is for you.
thank you. I think that's something I'm still unpacking.
Mm,
As as not learning, but like continue to see the ways that the current systems of oppression influence the way that we relate to one another, and influence obviously like ideas of the nuclear family and community, which I know has been talked about today as well. I think for me, it's just like, if I can move as freely as I want while also knowing that I have innate worthiness in this world, that changes everything, right? And if I can do that, and other people see that, witness that,
mhm,
can move in that way in themselves, that's it. Like that is the magic, right? Really small things too, to like realizing, we say this all the time, love is abundant, but like, what if we realize that we have a deep connection to the earth? How would we treat it better? How would that inform what we stand up for?
mhm,
Right. And so I feel like there's those layers of like, if I can, yeah, if I can move in this world centering me, even though I am part of the whole, that's it right there, right? That I do this for me to survive in this system, but I am connected to the whole. And so if we all do this, isn't that how we make the changes that we need
mm,
in our society?
mhm. I feel that deep in my soul. The
Yeah.
language I've been using for the last few years is that of a relationship ecology and a relationship
Mm,
landscape, because I
yes,
feel like I feel like I've leaned into a lot of Indigenous wisdom and learning from this. And in First Nations, a lot of First Nations have this way of talking of all my relations, and
yes,
that isn't just about the human relationships; it's also about the non-human people and
yes.
the animals, the land. I live near a really beautiful river that has her own personality, and I treat her and talk about her like a person, and
Mm-hmm.
there is something, I mean, that I think that's part of subverting the colonial perspective of seeing the environment as a resource to manage and extract
Yes,
rather than a being that we live with and we have a relationship with.
yeah, yeah. Something that that's like coming up for me too as we're talking, because I too, yeah, am learning from Indigenous wisdom. And one thing for my background in my lineage, my family's Buddhist. And so I've been trying to figure out the ties between my Buddhist kind of upbringing and philosophies and how that relates to my solo polyam. And I remember sitting last year in a temple, um, meditating with, and we were guided by monks there. And I looked at this monk and I was like, you, you're not partnered. You're not, you don't have a nuclear family. You live like I want to live in the jungles of Chiang Mai, like, differently, but I'm here right now in Southern California. But you like just looking at these monks who are so revered, who are so deeply respected for their aloneness, quote unquote aloneness,
Mm-hmm.
right? Who are put on pedestals because they have chosen the path of enlightenment that requires them to be alone, to cut off their families,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And have done so because they are dedicating their life to citizens of the world, who are
Mm-hmm.
dedicating their life to learning about the earth and
Mm-hmm.
connecting with the land and
Mm.
connecting with humanity. And I'm looking at them, I'm like, why am I being slut shamed?
You
Why
right?
am I'm doing the same thing? I have a little more sex than you, and then it just comes down to this like, oh, it's really just layers of purity culture. It's really just layers of like you people have a problem with the sexuality
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day. Because if I sat there and I came out and like, I'm gonna go into monkhood, I'm gonna go become a nun and do the same exact things I was doing that I'm choosing now for myself of not having kids, not being married, devoting myself to the greater, creator,
Mm-hmm.
which I do feel like I am doing, but because I have a sexuality, that's the real problem.
And I so resonate with what you just described. The spiritual tradition and practice that I grew up with, there are swamis. It's a Vedic and tantric tradition, and so I would look at that as well. And I've had that same thought process of like, that's basically what I'm doing. I'm a renunciate of sorts because I'm saying I am not a householder. That is not my personal path. There are some solo poly people for whom that is their path to be parents and co-parent and so forth. But for me, that isn't. And the biggest difference is I haven't taken a vow of chastity.
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
in the sort of bigger picture of the evolution of health and safety in medicine, like we have more access and availability to safer sex and medicines and so forth than we have in the past. So there was a time and a place where chastity would have made sense because you didn't have that technology, and now we do. And I think it's so interesting to think about, like, for those of us for whom solo polyamory is part of a path of political resistance and saying I'm not part of that householder path, is it like, can we see it as that spiritual path of like monkhood and being in service to the wider community? I think there's a really beautiful exploration to have there.
Mm-hmm. And I do feel like part of this is to be in service of the wider community. I don't think that I could hold space for my friends and my family in the way that I do if
Mm-hmm.
I were to choose to be a wife or a mother.
Mhm.
right? I don't think that I could serve or offer my medicine in the way that I do if I had chosen that path, right? So in a
Yeah.
lot of ways, this journey for me absolutely is part of the greater calling to care for the collective.
Mm, that's beautiful. Well said.
Mm,
I see
thank you.
some resonance from folks in the chats. Yeah, Cameron says I really resonate with this. Thank you. And
Mhm.
earlier on, some folks talking about, like, Roz says, yeah, that being seen as a potential home wrecker, especially given how I talk about refusing to agree to hierarchical rules, leaves people worried. And it's interesting how people assume SOPO is selfish. Like, I feel called to do healing. And I mean, my
Mm.
experience of the SOPO community at large has been that we are some of the most generous and compassionate people. And maybe
Mhm.
that's just the sort of confirmation bias bubble that I'm in. I don't know. I'm sure there are selfish and mean and awful
Sure,
solo poly people out there somewhere that have to exist.
somewhere.
But like you said, like that culture that exists in the group, and I think that has come through in the unconferences and the community at large, like there is that I think that mindfulness of we all know how hard it is to care for ourselves. And we have, I think, we cultivate that awareness of how we care for others and the ecosystem at large. So we're not just caring for the other people who are SOPO, we're caring for all the people in our community. And I know that sometimes when I act that way, that gets misread. People are like, well, what's your agenda? And I'm
Mhm.
like, my agenda is to care for the community that I live in. That's I joke that all the work I do is very selfish because I as a relationship coach, I want to have an easier time dating. That's my
I
selfish
love it. Yes,
motivation.
absolutely.
and,
Absolutely.
and if I do this work enough, if I connect with enough other people, we'll make it easier for all of us.
Yeah, that's so true. That's a good way to look at it. I
Jada, oh,
I
go
think we're
ahead.
hitting the top of the hour. Yeah.
We're
Oh, yes.
gonna hit the top of the hour soon, but go
Yes.
ahead.
I would just want to say, like, I've owned the selfishness. I'm like, I'm selfish, but I'm not greedy, and
Yes.
I'm okay with that. I'm selfish in the sense that I center myself, but I'm not greedy where it takes away from someone else. And I'm okay with that, and that's just the semantics of it, but that's what I'll end with today.
Awesome. Jada, this has been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for sharing everything that you shared today. Your authenticity and your conviction in yourself really shines through in how you speak.
Thank you.
If folks want to find you, how can they find you?
Yeah, JAYDA_KISSED, KISSED is where I'm at on Instagram. And then my actual just like website is Auntie Jada. So I also go by Sex Positive Asian Auntie. So auntiejada.com.
Awesome.
Thank you,
Thank you
Mel.
so much, Jada. This has been a delight.
Thank you.
Oh, I love having these conversations. They're so enriching. And I don't know about the rest of you, but my heart feels really, really full. And we have more yet to come. So I'm going to invite on Jess. Hi, Jess. Another person that I'm excited to meet finally and talk.
Hi.
So I kept seeing Jess's name in different online spaces. And I was like, is this the same Jess? Like, we're here in this SOPO group, and then we're in the somatic sex educator group, and then there's like other Facebook groups. And I'm like, that's the same Jess. Holy, we have a lot in common, apparently.
Apparently, yeah.
And I'm so excited to have you here. You are a sex coach and relationship coach, and you post on Instagram as Beloved Coaching. But you also do some incredible work with folks around grief. And I know you've done some really beautiful work during the pandemic around dating for people who are immunocompromised or have different access needs because of the pandemic. And I'm really excited to have you here. So would you like to share anything more about yourself to introduce you to everyone?
Yeah. I'm like, I just got done with clients. I'm a little bit hopped up on caffeine, so I'm really wiggly.
Good.
So if anybody else wants to wiggle along, it's welcome. But yeah, my name is Jess DeVries. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Portland, Oregon on Clackamas and Cowlitz land. And I don't know, I was very like, I think your intuition of like Jada going and then me going, I'm like, that just like set me up for all the things that were in my head. But grew up Christian, evangelical Christian. And that is kind of how I came to this work, is processing the grief of leaving my religious community and coming into my sexuality. And so that's kind of where I come to this space, and to solo polyamory. Really, I am my own primary, and also I'm a relationship anarchist. So that's kind of that space. But a lot of that is also informed by coming from a place of no choice, like being told that you have one choice as far as a path. And so, yeah, I do embodied sex and pleasure coaching. I do embodied grief work. And I'm real staunch about access in a pandemic. So yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
No wonder we've overlapped in so
Yeah.
many ways.
Yeah.
Like, of course, it makes sense.
Yeah.
And you know, when you're talking about that, like coming out of evangelical upbringing, you know, that's not an experience that I've had, although my mother was very conservative in other ways. But I've certainly seen that with a lot of the folks I work with and people who come into my monogamy detox course. They're coming from that post-evangelical, post-religious upbringing, where they have suddenly blasted out of that restrictiveness like a rocket ship.
Yeah, blasted is a great word.
and they are grappling with that grief, of there's a kind of reckoning of like, well, my whole life I've been told that my purpose is to be on that relationship escalator with somebody and to, you know, check off these check boxes of having kids, family, yada yada yada, and suddenly I'm not doing that. And there's a grief, there's an anxiety around that. I see it come through as a somatic nervous system response.
Oh yeah.
Where like we don't know how to deal without that thing that is familiar, even though we know that familiar thing is not for us.
Yeah, and it's connected so deeply into like your goodness as a human, and your acceptance into community and into like beyond human community, whether you call that God or divinity or universe.
Yeah. So for you, that journey of discovering the possibilities off the escalator, would you be willing to share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I was thinking over, because it's not a story I tell very often. Like I talk about the church part a lot, and I talk about like my love of masturbation a lot, which all of that ties into this. But like I remember, like if I look all the way back to as a kid, like just having all of this love. Like I used to write poems about love when I was like 7, like this, and like, and I love that. And I grew up in the Tanana Valley in Alaska, and so like I'm deeply rooted in that place. Like I grieve that place when I'm not there. When I am able to visit, like it's a overwhelming homecoming. And so like deeply connected to people, deeply connected to plants, animals, land. And then also having this like spiritual tradition of like being connected to the creator, which was my understanding at that point. And then like fast forward, like in purity culture, in the middle of like, you don't like, in the culture that I was in, like most of my friends did not kiss their partners until their wedding day.
Wow.
And so like or they did and they didn't talk about it. Like right. But that was the expectation. And so then being someone who's like, I don't know if I want to date. I don't know if I want to do this. And then on the other side of that, being like, I don't really know anything. Like all of that was a load of shit. What's possible?
Mm-hmm.
Which, like, my first partner after leaving the church was very kinky. We were open, but I didn't know it. Again, like
Yeah.
that old story. Um, but dating that person, like, definitely opened me up to, like, there's so much more possibility
Mm.
than what I was ever told. And then I still call it the still small voice inside of me, like the intuition, the string that pulls. And so every successive person that I dated after that was just like, oh, here's something else to consider. Oh, here's something else to consider. And I was watching myself get enmeshed, default, and collapse into power dynamics, which is, I came from a very patriarchal family, came from a very patriarchal religion. And then being like, I don't like myself
Mm.
when I'm in that space. So how can I open myself back up to, like, what feels good in my body, what feels good in my heart? And so, like, it's just kind of been a journey of like, oh, I like spending time with this person. Oh, I really like my garden. I call my garden my girlfriend. Like, I spend most of my time there, but like kind of following that pull of like, where do I find the most satisfaction? Where do I find the
Mm-hmm.
most joy? Where do I find the most um, eroticism,
Yeah.
contentment? And for me, the answers have been very different than many people in my life. Yeah.
Mm. What a lovely journey.
Yeah.
Like,
It's been really something.
yeah, I mean, I say lovely, and I'm like, I know it's not a walk in a park. It's not a walk in a park
Yeah.
for any of us, but I I really appreciate that throughout that journey, there's been that piece of connecting to the natural world for
Mm-hmm.
you. And I feel like that is such a grounding presence
Yeah.
that can be easy for us to forget at times if we're not making a conscious effort. Again, it's one of those relationships we can become complacent about, right?
Absolutely.
Our relationship with the natural world.
Yeah. And my garden will tell me if I've been blowing her off. Like,
Yep.
it's it's very more so than humans will, actually.
I find that with animals too. Like my senior cat passed away recently, and he'd been living with my ex-husband for a number of years, and I finally got him back. And he had a lot of anxiety and a lot of other health issues going on, but he was very clear at communicating his needs.
Mhm.
So clear at communicating his needs, and that's so refreshing when sometimes it's hard for humans to communicate our needs. And I learned from him of like, oh, it's important for me to communicate these needs when I have them.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Pets are very good for that.
they are so the possibilities off that escalator when we consciously make that leap away
Mm-hmm.
from mononormativity, heteronormativity, um, the enmeshment normativity paradigms. What do you think becomes possible? What have you found becomes possible?
Anything. Like, that's the actually take this earring out. Yeah, it really, like, anything is possible when you, like, are showing up and being like, oh, I'm a human with my needs and desires and, like, my embodied experience, and you are a human with all of those things. And, like, how can we play together? Like, what is, like, are you going to be my let's cook a meal once a month and make it really fancy friend because
Mm-hmm.
we both love food? Or are you going to be my um you know tie me up and hit me until I have bruises because it's hot friend, or are you both of those things? The like, I think part of it too, like we're in the somatic sexuality group, and so it's like a lot of erotic laborers are in that group, and so also within that, a large part of my community is like, oh, I have this need to learn this thing about my body that is sexual, or I just need to process this anger, and this would be the way I can, like, so there's also this collaborative, how do I want to say this, like with my friends within that community, like, oh, like we can be sandwich friends, we can be kink friends, we can be like sex nerd, like I just need to learn about my body, can you help me learn about my body? We can be partners, we can be like there's so much possibility. But then I also think like part of that desire of off the escalator too is to actually name our connections. So like regardless of if you are in a monogamous relationship or not, like honoring the intensity of your intimacy with your best friend, or the connection with your grandparent, or you know, that the truth of like the constellation of the relationships in our lives is where I'm like, let's let's name it, let's have choice in that, let's honor like what is more true, I guess, is probably that piece. And I think within that, like, oh, my choice to find community, like my closest people live in Canada at this point. Right. But that's because we just kept saying yes to like, oh, do you want to hang out on Zoom like sometime? And then, oh, you also grew up in the church, let's send inappropriate Jesus memes to each other, and like and it's like it just keeps progressing in the like, what's the next right thing, because we're curious and open to anything's possible.
Yeah.
So
I love what you said about the collaborative piece there as well. You know, so many people, I think when we enter into polyamory, especially if we're doing polyamory without a primary partner, there can be a tendency to compartmentalize relationships and to you know, that kind of like parallel polyamory thing. I always think of it as like, I put things away in the cupboard when I'm done with them. Like, this is the relationship I pull out when I want to be tied up and hit someone. Like, and then I put them back on that shelf. And then this is the relationship I pull out when I want to, like, let's do some crafting or some cooking together. And then I put it back on the shelf. And it works for some people. That's great. And that sometimes is what we do. But the collaborativeness kind of adds in another layer, or another dimension, I should say, to the richness of the tapestry that I think we do get to explore as solo polyamorists, where there is that openness. Like, it feels like a make your own adventure. Build your own adventure relationships.
Yeah. And I think also the other part, I mean, this is true to my experience. So this, of course, like everybody's different, but like allowing that change over time. Like I don't know what to call them these days, but we were primary partners years ago. And then we didn't talk for 7 years, and then came back together and have just kind of like finally settled into this, like about twice a year we'll reach out and be like, I need help with this particular sexual magical thing. And that's like, and we'll text a little bit in between and whatever, but it's like at one point we wanted to live together and build a family, and then that didn't happen for lots of reasons, and we both shifted and grew, and now we're in this place of like, that thing that pulled us together initially is still there, but it really like needs to look this way because of the way that each of our lives are in 2023. Yeah, so it like, I don't know, I will often say like I'm a solo polyamorist with a kink for long-term relationships, and so like I am like that person who's like, yeah, if you're here, unless things really go south, like you're here forever.
Yeah.
And it will like shift and change as we do.
And you know, that goes back to, on the relationship escalator trajectory, there is that expectation that if you step off that escalator with someone, then you cannot contact them. You know,
Mhm.
I one of my early poly partners, when I was like, I would like to go back to being friends and not dating, their response was to block me on Facebook because
Yeah.
they were like, that's, I can't. And I was like, what? But like, we live 3 blocks away from each other or something like that. Like, can we just, and I think one of the most nourishing parts for me in my non-monogamy has been that relationships can shift and transform. And there are people who it's like, this isn't working for us right now. Let's find how we can relate in a way that works. And that has
Yeah.
included like, you know, commit partners or people that have like, you're a deep friend and occasionally we hook up. And then like someone I dated for 2 years, we broke up. And then now we have occasional makeouts when it feels safe enough to with COVID. And, you know, like, and then there are those people who it's like, we broke up, we tried to stay friends and we drifted apart over time. And then
Mhm.
there's some people where it's like, yeah, it went south, we're not even going to try. But that there is the freedom to again collaborate on what does a relationship look like when it does shift, if you decide to change trajectory on that relationship, or the goals in that connection change.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that also ties back into like the relationship anarchy aspects of things, where it's
Mm-hmm.
like, why is like a intimate relationship where we fuck more important than an intimate relationship where we don't?
Yeah.
And like that, like the pulling back into like, well, this is just a friendship.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Just.
just a friendship. Like my longest, besides the relationship that I have with myself, like my friends are like, I have a dear friend I've known since I was 4. Because again, kink for long-term relationships. Like I want to keep you, please.
Yeah.
Um, but the like the I don't know, the valuing of enmeshment or the valuing of sex as or romance as the like, that makes this more important
Mm-hmm.
than any other connection that I might have.
Mm-hmm.
Really, I mean, it irks the shit out of me, but also like I don't understand it. Like I really just don't understand it.
I agree. I mean, it's one of those pieces that I see come up in that monogamy hangover for people, of like judging the relationships that we have according to either the amount or the quality of sex that we have in them. And like, sex is an important thing for many people, certainly not for everybody.
Yeah.
And it's going to be an important aspect of many people's relationships, but it's not the be all and end all. And that there are so many ways we can connect, and there's so many other
Mhm.
metrics we can use to assess, am I feeling nurtured and nourished and supported by this connection?
Yeah.
And the freedom to do that, I think, has been one of the most fascinating parts of my own solo poly journey. I just want to acknowledge in the chat, as we've been chatting, there's been some really lovely back and forth. Someone shared, I need more tie me up and hit me friends.
Yeah.
I miss those now with managing COVID consciousness. And I quickly typed in like, you know, same. It's an opportunity to explore our medical fetishes though, maybe.
Mhm.
And someone else shared, I literally just bought a gas mask to wear to events. So a good example there of that community creativity in action of
Mhm.
how we collaborate to find solutions and support each other.
Yeah. Well, and like touching into COVID too, like that has shifted the way to show up in relationship,
So much.
and like what is intimacy. Thank goodness for the internet. Like
Mm-hmm.
for so many reasons, right? Like being able to have connection with people across the world at this point, but like to feel less alone.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, community looks lots of ways.
Yeah. And I find, with where we're at right now with COVID, as we go into the fall and winter surge here in North America, thankfully more people are kind of tuning into like, I want to be more cautious. I need to take care of myself. And but it's been interesting to see how for a lot of people they've felt that starvation of their hedonism. And as soon as lockdowns and other guidelines and restrictions have lifted around health and safety, people have kind of gone to that other extreme because of that hunger, which I think is totally understandable, that, hunger builds and we get hungry and we want to act on that. And, to find the ways to channel that in a COVID safe way it is not easy. So I'm wondering, like, do you have any thoughts on how people can support themselves doing that as we are about to enter in to what's already a surge in COVID and also like other seasonal illnesses right now?
All the things. Yeah, I think there's a passage from a book that Meg John Barker and Justin Hancock wrote in the UK that like is just basically like, well, what is sex? Like if I write you a letter and it's hot and steamy and I get turned on while that happens, and then you read it and you get turned on while that happens, like was that sex? Like I don't know. I mean, in my worldview, yes, but like it's a question to ask, right? And so when bodies can't be in shared space, or it's harder to be in shared space, or what are our alternatives to building that like sexy, romantic, erotic connection? Does that mean we wear masks while we have sex? Does that mean that like we don't touch but we're in the same space and like masturbating together? Does that mean that we're just on the internet? Are we texting? Are we videoing? Are we writing long passionate letters like they used to do before?
Yeah.
Like I still think about my grandma. Like my grandpa moved to Alaska from Minnesota, and she was there, and phones were not a big thing in Alaska in the late 40s, early 50s. And so like letters were their medium. And why can't that be a medium now?
Right.
But then I also like, I don't know, coming back to the like solo polyamorous, and I am my own my own partner, and the work that I do, like people are like, oh, do you work with couples? I'm like, no, because the main relationship I'm most excited about is the one that you have with yourself. And so like how can you nurture the erotic and romantic connection with yourself, right? Whether that's, there's so much capacity, right? We have so many nerve endings, and we have like our brains are just filled with possibilities. But like, what feels good to your hands? What feels good to your mouth, to your tongue, to your ears? What's nice to look at? And how do you like integrate that in those places of less access to in-person time with other people? And nurture yourself in that way? Because like, yes, fucking somebody else or multiple somebody else's is really lovely, but also like we have a whole body to work with, right? Yeah.
I really appreciate that, playing with the sensory delights and the sensory pleasures, and going into the somatic work. Like there's so much around working with our senses that helps us to orient and to ground and to come into, I think, more capacity for relationship for ourselves. It's a practice that is like, it feels like it just perpetually supports. It's like I tune into my senses, that helps me connect with myself. I connect with myself, I'm more connected to my desires. Then I can navigate my desires as to how else I want to feed my senses. And then that helps me be more connected, and so on and so forth. It's just this lovely, lovely cycle. Um, and I think, going back to some of the other conversations we've had earlier today, that is one of the pieces of coming out of spaces of enmeshment and codependency and primary partnership and escalator spaces, when we come into the soloness. It is about learning about ourselves and figuring out how do we come back into that self relationship, or how do we discover that for the first time even. Yeah. I think I can unmute you there. Did that work? I asked you to unmute.
Okay, there we go.
Perfect.
Yeah, I was trying to be polite and not cough into my mic. Yeah, coming back into self relationship. I mean, I don't know. I think that's the whole thing, honestly. Like, regardless of where you come from, I think most people are taught out of listening to themselves, to their voice.
Yeah.
What they want. That's largely just because we don't see children as whole people, which is a whole, like, that's a left turn that we could go on. But like, the practice of, what do I want? What do I need? Can I give a little or a lot of that to myself?
Yeah.
Am I doing something because I think I should, versus what I want to, and honoring like those boundaries within our own selves. Like, it's just practice for really being out in the world with everybody else. Yeah.
Beautifully said. And that, I feel like, is a wonderful note for us to wrap up on, because we're at the half hour.
We are.
So Jess, if folks want to connect with you, where are the best places for them to find you?
Yeah, I'm most active on Instagram, which is at Beloved Coaching. And then belovedcoaching.net is my website. So I'm also on Facebook and Twitter, but that's those two spaces are neither here nor there, I think, at this point, for business.
Well, thank you so much,
Yeah.
Jess. I really appreciate the sweetness that you bring to your work, and to that you brought to this conversation too. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yay. We are coming up to the end of our day today, and I am so grateful for everybody. I want to invite you to stick around if you can for that last half hour. I'm going to bring on one more special guest as a surprise guest, one of the other mods from the Solo Polyamory group. I am so grateful. I feel very nourished and filled from today's conversations, but that's me. I don't know how you feel. I hope that you feel the same way. And if you missed some of the conversations, you can go have a look at the live stream. Those of you who registered for Zoom, I'll be sending out the links for everything, and I'll figure out the editing process at some point this week, I hope. But please bear with me. I am a one-woman show over here. Someone once emailed me like, can you have your personal assistant do this thing? And I was like, yes, my personal assistant is me. That's my soloness in action. So I'm going to invite Bram to join me here. So Bram is one of the mods for the Solo Polyamory group. Bram has been a moderator in the Solo Polyamory group for many years now, and I think you were also one of the OG members in the first group. And we met because of the Solo Polyamory group. We had connected through the Solo Polyamory group, and then I saw that Bram was visiting Vancouver, BC, where I was living at the time, and they live in Winnipeg. And I was like, let's go for coffee. Let's hang out. Let's meet each other. Because that's been one of my most favorite things to do, is like meet random people from the Solo Polyamory group. And we found out that we have the same birthday. So I have a whole hypothesis that there is a higher chance of you being solo polyamorous if your birthday is April the 9th. Because at the first solo polyam on conference in Vancouver in 2017, there were 3 of us who were April 9ers. And out of 70 people, 3 people had the same birthday. I feel like that says something. I'm just that's my anecdotal evidence for that. But in addition to being my birthday twin, Bram's also become a really good friend, and is someone who I consider part of my support network, as in my friendship circles. And we've also volunteered together on the board for the Canadian Polyamory Advocacy Association. And I feel like Bram and I are very used to like switching hats in our relationship in many ways. So hi, Bram. Welcome. Do
Hello, and thank
you
you.
want to say anything else to introduce yourself?
Not really. Although the point that was just made about maybe not controlling our kids. The reason that I wasn't able to join earlier is that here in Winnipeg, of course, we recently had a bunch of people who were really objecting to any kind of queer education for youth in schools. And so there was a decent counter protest at the time, but there was a really large rally planned for today. And so I was out there marching in the mist and the rain with a crowd that to me looked as big as like our usual main corporate pride events. And it was just so great to be with community there. So I apologize for missing the earlier part, but it was for a good cause.
A very good cause.
Yes, absolutely. Aside from that, I mean, I think you covered a lot of the highlights. I've also been a bit of an organizer here locally in my community, so I have helped to organize poly events in Winnipeg. And I guess that's kind of the starting point anyway. So thanks for having me, and I'm pleased to be here.
I started off today with Miss Love as a surprise guest. So it's been nice to have some of the other mod squad through this event. I had hoped to have a panel of us together, but it's herding cats with schedules and everything, and so we made it work somehow. And one of the reasons why I think I initially wanted to bring you on as another moderator is because I knew you had experience community building, doing community work in your local poly community in Winnipeg. And I called this event Community Conversations because we are a community, and like Marcia said earlier, like there's a difference between community and a scene. And I think there can sometimes be that solo poly scene. But there's also a community that exists within it. And I think we're mindful, at least I try to be mindful of not being cliquey about it. In the way that I've wanted to do today's event, I'm like, I'm just hosting this. We can talk about the things we do for work. We can promote ourselves if we want to, but like, it's really just about having a conversation and sharing and building that collective knowledge. But I'd be really curious, if you have any wisdom or insights to share about your experience both locally and online, as someone who's building community. And if you wanted to add in, like, as someone who, I think we used to tease you about this, like exercising that chromosome, that perceived chromosome privilege in certain moments and places. Yeah.
It's quite fascinating. I have to say that I owe a great debt of gratitude to the original founder of the Poly Winnipeg community, who was a queer trans person of color. And so having that kind of laid the groundwork for our community here has meant that we've always had a great deal of trans inclusion, a great deal of queer inclusion. Winnipeg's a very white city, so we haven't always had as much racial diversity present. But again, there always has been at least some of that. And so as an organizer, one of my biggest kind of priorities is to pay attention to people who are more marginalized than I am and listen to what they have to say first. I do try to use my, as you say, perceived, male privilege. I am non-binary, but clearly I walk through the world in a way which gets interpreted as masculine. So for better or for worse, it's quite fascinating when I'm in, meetings and things, and even earlier on when we were volunteering with under a different board for the CPAA. There would occasionally be, the mansplainers who would pipe up, and I would often be able to shut that down a little more easily. Moderating in the Solo Poly group, a Facebook group, similar kind of thing, with that bearded uh, Facebook profile picture shows up all of a sudden, some things that maybe, oh, you little girlies, you don't really know what you're talking about. It's like, oh, okay. But it's so bizarre because like I'm not saying anything new, right? Like
No,
I'm
I've seen you
just
literally repeat word for word what Roz or I have said.
yeah. And somehow that's now magically enough, which frustrates me to no end. But if it means that I can support the two of you and others, hey, I will happily do that. Yeah. So, I mean, my background is wide and varied. I also spent time in university studying conflict resolution studies, and so I have a lot of those kinds of values deep within me as well. And that idea of collaboration, as people have mentioned, community building. Um, I am a bit of a reluctant leader in that I tend not to compete for a leadership role, but if there's a vacuum, I will usually kind of try and step into it. Which again is kind of an interesting challenge for me, especially because I had to get out of the habit of talking over folks. I definitely had a lot more of the obliviousness to my male privilege when I was younger, and would very easily just talk over everyone in the room. But it's like, nope, I need to listen more. And, even when it's hard to listen, if I'm reacting, okay, don't push back, listen to what people are saying, and try to find kind of where we can the healthy common ground. Um,
Mhm.
there isn't always healthy common ground. As you mentioned at the start, transphobia, fat phobia, slut shaming, all these kinds of things. We can't tolerate those in our community. The paradox of tolerance. If you tolerate intolerance, then all that's left are the bigots. And it's very difficult to kind of walk that line sometimes, and try to figure out how to foster and encourage the healthy behaviors well. You know, are other folks able to be educated, or do they simply need to be removed from the community for safety until they have a chance to educate themselves?
Yeah, and I think that's one of those places where, as a mod team in the Solo Polyamory Facebook group, like we don't have like a single rule where like, let's talk about it. Like, does this feel like something that's worth kicking someone out over? And there are times where one of us will get triggered and be like, I want to give them the boot, and that someone else is like, it doesn't really feel that way. Or there'll be times where like, I think I can give them another chance, and someone else is like, no, I wouldn't. And I think we all come down on different places in that in different times. And having, I think, the team to be able to have that conversation with has been really valuable. I see Rod's giving us the thumbs up too. It's like, um it is not always cut and dry as to what is happening, and sometimes even understanding when someone is behaving in a problematic way or saying something, that question of like, well, can we give them some leeway for their learning journey? Are they open to feedback? Are they receptive to other perspectives, or to changing, or to understanding the impact of what they've done? And I think in any kind of community building, that comes in so valuable, because that is about how we create community spaces that are positive environments, is having that openness and signaling that culture of, we are open as long as you remain open to learning. And we, as people who are in a position of leadership, are also going to remain open to learning. We're not going to hold ourselves on this like, we are the experts, we are now the gatekeepers of solo polyamory, and we say what goes and what doesn't. Although I'm always amused when someone tries to like mansplain it to me. And like, it's, yeah, we do, I think, at least I say this as humbly as I possibly can, we try to hold some humility in that positional power.
Mhm. Yeah, and it helps that, I mean, as you're making a joke earlier about herding cats, like Sure, solo poly folks, we're absolute ironclad rulers. They will listen to us because of what we say in our position of authority. Like, no, we inherently challenge authority. We challenge, hierarchical structures in every other part of our life. Why would we not challenge or at least be critically aware of them in our community organization? Yeah, and so like any community organizer who's not willing to be like called out or listen to the community, that is a huge red flag for me.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's one of those things that it's always difficult to navigate, but yeah, we try to do our best and maintain that, absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, we've talked about this as well in our wearing our hats as Canadian Poly Advocacy Association, and like this sort of ongoing project of can we support groups with stronger guidelines to help them be able to replicate that. And I think the solo polyamory group is a really good case study for how that's worked out, because I hear that again and again from people, that the quality of conversation there is different from other polyamory groups. And that's not to say that it's better. I don't think there is a one better than the other. It's all about what you're looking for. And as Ross says, we value productive conflict, and I think that's a relationship value to have as well, as being able to have intimacy through conflict, to learn through what are our conflicts together, what are the differences we have, and how do we deepen our understanding of one another that way. And I think we do that not just as a mod squad, but I'd like to think we do that as a wider community as well.
Yeah, well, and similar to, I think, how my local community here, I really benefited from the labor of a queer trans person of color. And so I've done my best to like honor that and keep that going. When we look at the solo poly group, there's been a lot of contributions from queer folks, from trans folks, again, people of color as well. And having that as like the starting point, I think makes it easier to kind of build on it. And it's fascinating in the sense that there's also been a lot of other solo poly groups that have cropped up over time, largely, I think, in reaction to perceived failings in the main group, our group. Call it what you will.
I love it.
I love it. I love when they form, because then it's like, all right, here's some interesting opportunities. I usually join those groups as well. So some of them are like, okay, this is the unmoderated one. So we feel that moderation is too heavy-handed. You're too tight of a focus on solo poly, so we're going to have an unmoderated version. Or another one where it's like, okay, we think there's too much couple privilege happening in the group. So we're going to have one that's specifically for people who swear that they will never, ever cohabitate with their partners. And so it's great to have that diversity.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they don't tend to get as much traction. And so it's a piece where, I think we're doing something right with it. It's challenging. But I don't know, it feels like we don't have a single leader at all. And a lot of these other groups that form, it's because one person had a vision, and it's just not that, objectively, it's just not that broadly appealing of a vision. It doesn't appeal to the same number of folks. So while they're all important, and I absolutely value and treasure that those groups exist, and again, I tend to join them myself, when I come back to it, if there's a place that I want to talk about these kinds of things, it's with a community that has a culture of compassion, that has a culture of exploration, that has a culture of, sometimes tough love. Like, okay, yeah, this is on you, boo. Sometimes that's the answer, and it may not always be the most pleasant answer. But knowing that it's a community that really has the best interests for the rest of the community in mind, that kind of structure, I'm grateful to have been able to join it. But huge thank you to everyone that came before in terms of starting that process up.
And I'm grateful for those other niche groups that spring up. I think it's been, like you said, it's been refreshing to have them there, because when someone is like, why are my posts getting rejected, blah, 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 or something like that, we can be like, well, that's just like our group guidelines. And if
Mhm.
you want to do something else, well, there's these other groups. Here's an option for you. And Roz just put something really great in the Zoom chat here. I like that there are folks who are leaders in the group, even if they are not modmin. That's important. Yeah. And I like that Facebook group features have allowed us to like do more to recognize those people. Like it'll show you who the top contributors are.
Mhm.
And I think that is really valuable because it isn't, I keep going back to this TED talk I watched years ago about how to create a movement. It's not the first person who stands up and says we should do this thing. Like I tweeted Aggie and I'm like, surely we're not the only people. There's got to be more than just us, and it's the people who stand up and follow that person. They are the ones who create a movement. So it was those first people who are like, I'm on board. Tell me where to find this group. I am in, and who participated in those conversations and who keep those conversations going. And,
Mhm.
big props to Aggie. And I think in the early days of the group, Aggie did so much to create those conversation starters and to generate those questions. And I think it's beautiful that now the group is at that point where 13,000 people, as moderators, we rarely post ourselves.
Mhm.
And we might jump in on threads on occasion, but we really are able to step back and let other people take the lead in
Mhm.
the conversations.
Yeah.
And I think that's that servant leadership aspect where
Mhm.
we're there to hold the space. I feel like we're not standing on front of a podium at the front of the room. We're more like the people welcoming in through the door and be like, if you need a seat, there's seats there. If you need
Mhm.
anything, please let us know. If you have access needs, like, give me a hands up. And I think that is really, it's a lovely thing to be part of, and it's a lovely thing to see in action.
Mhm. Yeah, it's fascinating because I just kind of stumbled into it. I had gone to the first Canadian Polyamory conference, and someone I met there just randomly invited me to this group. And so it's like, okay, that sounds interesting. I've never heard of this solo poly thing before, but this person that I just met's pretty neat. There's some other people I know in the group, so sure, let's join it and see what it's about.
And just
And
for
it's been,
folks wondering, Singleton is your actual legal last name.
it actually is, yes,
Yeah.
which I apparently have surprised people on that one, but yes, it's not a pseudonym. It's just the one I was born with. Um, but yeah, so just having a chance to like see this group and like finding a online group that is well managed, well moderated, and has healthy discussion. And at the time, I was still fairly new in my polyamory experiences. I certainly wasn't identifying with solo poly, although I think I probably got invited because at the time I functionally was, right. So there was a little bit less of a distinction in those days between solo poly by choice or a solo poly by circumstance. And so I just got invited to it. And as I, was able to read these things and reflect on my own values, it created this really strong virtuous circle of like, okay, yeah, there are definitely a lot of things here that are resonating with me and helping me on my journey, seeing all the experiences that other people have and have shared. I often joke that I learn quickly by making mistakes quickly, but if I can learn from someone else's mistakes, then hey, that's also a great way to do things. And so it turned into this, really fascinating shift. And when I was eventually offered the chance to join as a moderator, I was like, well, here's a chance to kind of give something back to the community as well,
Mhm.
because I have gotten so much from it. It has absolutely changed the way I think about polyamory. And over time, with the introduction of ideas of relationship anarchy, it's really changed the way I think about all of my relationships.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be the person I am today without this resource. And so that's, I think, really important to just register how much of an impact this has had on so many people.
Thank you, Bram. I feel like that's a lovely note for us to just wrap on this bit of the conversation, because I'm going to very selfishly take up some space to do a closing for the whole day. So I'm so selfish, so selfish. Um, but thank you for jumping on. I really appreciate you, my friend, and
Absolutely. And
your
thank you for
presence.
everything that you do.
I mean, like I said earlier, it's all very selfishly motivated. It's really so that, like, this all started because I was like, I don't want to be the only person doing this and talking about this. It would be great if there are other people talking about this so I didn't have to re-explain it every time I go on a date. Um, that's turned out pretty well. And not just for me, thankfully. It's a kind of selfishness that then has benefited a lot of other people, which I'm grateful for. Yeah, thank you, Bram. Thank you so much. Fabulous. So we are coming up to the end of today, and some of you have been jumping in and out of Zoom all day, and that's really awesome. My goodness, you guys are troopers. Some of you have been joining us on the live stream, which is also amazing. And some of you may be watching this later from the live stream recordings. And yeah, Sinclair just popped in the chat. What a day. It's been rich. It's been invigorating. I didn't know what to expect myself. I was just like, I'll just invite a bunch of people to come have conversations with me. I can talk. I'm a socially competent introvert. I can manage that for a few hours. And I don't know about you, but I feel like it's been really lovely. Those of you who joined on Zoom, I'll send out a little feedback thing at some point here, just getting your feedback about it. And, you know, I would love to see this continue in future years as a way to celebrate Solo Polyamory Day. And it doesn't have to be me organizing it. You know, folks can do their own thing. It'll be, maybe we have a team, maybe we do another unconference. Who knows? Who knows what comes together next year? But just to, you know, some kind of wrap up thoughts. I'm just kind of collecting myself here because I noticed my own nervous system feeling activated in that really good way, in that like giddy, excited, almost NRE kind of way. The excitement of all the different people who spoke, and getting to connect with people who I know really well and consider to be dear friends, and connecting with people whose work I love and admire and have never really talked to before today. And then also hearing and receiving all the feedback from folks and being part of that interaction has been so super sweet. What jumps into my mind immediately is reflecting back on something that Jada said around how we can be in service to the wider community and be in service to the wider world. And I would like to think that the exploration that our community has done about what is solo polyamory, what does it mean to prioritize ourselves, to be self-partnered, to be our own primary partner, to choose something that is not enmeshment, that is not the escalator. The work we've done as a community to understand that, I'd like to think that it has nourished not just the polyamorous dialogue, but the wider non-monogamy dialogue, and even the dialogue about relationships in the world at large. And I'm really, yeah, as I say this, I'm really enjoying this framework of, even if we're not coaches, even if we're not Instagram influencers, even if, you know, we're not doing more than just talking about our relationships with the people in our immediate anarchules and polycules and chosen family and communities, that there is something about living in that truth that offers people other possibilities that may be able to support them in having healthier relationships, whatever their relationship orientation looks like. And, you know, all these values we talked about today, like the trust building, the collaboration, the self-honoring, the self-knowing, stepping out of enmeshment, having that agency, but also that dance between agency and community. So not slipping into toxic levels of independence or isolationism, but actually looking for interdependence. Like, these are values that I think are healing for everybody. And, you know, when we look at the world around us, and there's a lot going on in the world around us. Late stage capitalism, it's not such a fun time to be in. But maybe the exploration of these values can help not just people who are solo polyamorous, but everyone in the world at large, that there's some nourishment all of us can receive from these values. And as people exploring solo polyamory, we really get to dive into them perhaps more so than others. So there's a certain kind of privilege in that. And, you know, as with all privileges, how do we leverage that privilege in service to those who may not have that privilege? How do we create access for others? How do we support them in being able to explore that? So those are my closing thoughts. I'm just seeing some lovely things in the chat here. Thanks, folks. It's been a really delightful experience to put this together. Yeah, I'm grateful for every single one of you. All the speakers all through today have been wonderful, just gems, treasures. I really wanted to make sure that I offered space to showcase some of the amazing people in this community who I think are also like thought leaders and influencers in their own ways. And it's been grand.